I do better typing notes because I can't read my writing. So
Go right ahead.
so just know that.
Oh,
Okay, is this on the screen now?
yes.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Okay, good. So just today's topic is writing styles and kind of some hints about that, and then developing articles from your dissertation or grant or something like that. So first of all, I think that we have a culture in academics that kind of poo-poos certain outlets. And the fact is that there are no outlets that are insignificant. You know, I think that in fact, we kind of need to do some work with university promotion and tenure committees to really help turn away from thinking that only one kind of outlet or publication is really valuable. And that's not to say that people should neglect those scholarly journals and publishing in them, but you know, I know that early in my career, there was a lot of kind of snobbish response to anybody who published in something like AJN. And, you know, AJN is such an important journal for our discipline. And I believe that everybody who is doing scholarly work needs to have at least one publication in either AJN or one of the other journals that reaches practicing nurses. So this is an important topic for us to look at today about why should we publish in different venues. First of all, every venue has a different audience, and you want to reach all of them. If you're not reaching practicing nurses, as a nurse, you're neglecting your duty to the discipline, really. I can't say that strongly enough. And you want those audiences to actually read what you write. So you can't write in a really put down way. And there's certain ways in which unknowingly, those of us in an academic discipline kind of convey a message to certain readers that they are not important and that we kind of look down on them just by phrases that we use or whatever. So it's very important to get feedback on your writing and especially if you're going to be publishing for a public audience to you know, get that feedback. And so we're going to talk about how to do that. So for all of the venues for your professional writing, you must use an active voice. And I'm going to talk about the myth that we are perpetrating in academics not to use personal pronouns, because when people do not use personal pronouns at all, their writing style becomes very, very unappealing for anybody. And it is difficult to read. So it's important to learn how to write in an active voice. There's two sources that I have here the link to that you may have already seen. Oh, you know what? I need to go to the presentation mode. I'm sorry. Let's see, view. Then I can just go right to that link. These are both in Nurse Author and Editor. I wrote them about, what is it, 2017? It's been a while. But everything in here is totally current to today. But it really goes through style and how to, you know, develop a style that expresses your own personality and your own way of thinking in the world, but also that is appealing to readers. And so let's see, I'm going to go back down here to an example that I put in here of where you need to put, okay, this is an example that I use that isn't actually published anywhere, but the first version is a 114 word passage with 10 instances of personal pronouns in this passage. And it's talking about my own background, which often you don't include this kind of information in your writing, but this is something that if you're writing with a feminist perspective, there's some degree of unveiling for any reader in any venue something about the position that you come from or where you are situated in the world in relation to the topic that you're writing. So this one talks about being an Anglo female in a Eurocentric tradition, even though I grew up on the Big Island of Hawaii in a multicultural environment where there were only 2 blind children in a predominantly Asian community. But the fact is that we all acquired a clear sense that being white was best, that it was better than anything else. We only learned about the history of Hawaii and the United States from the standpoint of white male experience, and probably had exactly the same curriculum about the United States history that many of you in this who are looking at this had when you were a child. And all of that is kind of, you'll see all of the different instances of personal pronouns in here. So that's okay, but it could be edited to be shorter. 2 instances of personal pronouns in an 80-word passage, where the only 2 times that I use the word I is where I start out situating myself. I grew up in the predominantly Asian community of Hilo, and I also experienced common ground and friendship with all of my classmates and neighbors. So I kind of picked up something about the various cultures that I grew up in. But schooling was derived solely from a Eurocentric US tradition, one that erased the reality of our diverse cultures and conveyed to all that to be Haole was a privilege. So to me, that's an example. It's just a short example to show that you need to have first person active voice in your writing, but you don't need to overdo it. It's important to remember that you are really, this isn't about you. And let's see if I can get back to our slides here. Yeah. But you do need to place yourself in the text. In the other article, Placing Others in the Text, I talk about how do you talk about other people, particularly people who are minorities or disadvantaged in some way, without implicitly placing yourself in a superior or a privileged position. One of the phrases that just really goes against the grain for me is something like when you're talking about a group of people, say a cultural group in your community, and then later you say, these people. Just that phrase, these people, kind of places you in a situation where you are observing other people from a place of privilege, where you have the right to say something about other people that may or may not be accurate to their own experience. And so in this article, I talk a lot about how do you refer to other people, how do you refer to people in terms of abilities or disabilities, and then go from there. One of the things that's also can be a little bit of a tension with your own style is following the guidelines and the style that is expressed in the journal or in the typical books, if you're writing a book or whatever, to be able to express yourself, but also follow the guidelines with every detail. And my experience as a journal editor, for example, I know from discussions at Inane with other editors that this is true for every single journal editor. The most common reason for rejecting an article before review is that it's not consistent with our style or with the journal purposes. And so you have to be mindful of that and tailor what you're writing to that journal. So for example, if you're writing from a dissertation and you are preparing an article that you're going to submit to a journal, and that journal, for whatever reason, turns out not to work out, then you have to go to another journal, but you can't just turn right around and submit exactly the same manuscript to another journal. It has to be revised, at least in terms of the format and styling of the citations and the references. But typically, even the writing, you go through and you think about that journal's audience. So there may be subtle differences in that journal's audience. For example, if you were trying to decide between submitting to ANS and to Image, for example, or the Journal of Scholarly, I'm dating myself here, the Journal of Nursing Scholarship, you can kind of picture in your mind's eye the slight, maybe more than slight differences between those two audiences. The Journal of Nursing Scholarship is a little bit easier to imagine because it's associated with Sigma Theta Tau. So you can kind of picture in your mind's eye people that are attending a Sigma event and kind of the kind of backgrounds that those people are likely, are likely to come to the event with. For ANS, it's a little bit more difficult, but we do know that the ANS audience is an audience that is comprised with a lot of doctoral students and people who are really looking for a kind of a challenge in several different ways. So it might be, there's a little bit of a slight possible difference. I'm not saying that the Sigma audiences don't have students and they don't have lots of people who are looking for a challenge, but just that slight shift in lens gives you a sense of whether some of the things that you might consider in your writing. And then make sure that your journal, that your article or whatever you've written is extremely well formatted and referenced because again, often the critique that will come back will detect anything that is not well referenced, and even formatting. Reviewers often comment on, say, material that could be presented in a table, or a table is included, but it is not addressed adequately in the narrative and things like that. So take a look at it. Patter, I think I've mentioned the Pat Thompson Patter blog before. This is the, she gives a lot of writing advice, and every single post that she's ever done is worth reading. I follow it and I read every single post that comes through because it is really so good. It is written for doctoral students, but by reading that, even though it is the audience that she's writing for is primarily for doctoral students, it helps me with kind of thinking through my own writing, plus the way that I advise other people to write. And for much of it, it is affirming to me in terms of the kinds of things that she recommends. For example, active voice, she talks about a lot. Oops. Okay, that was just in general. For the public, um, we've talked about writing blog posts and op-eds, but there's also magazines and newspapers. And if you have a chance to write for any of these outlets, it's absolutely essential that you take up that opportunity and do it. The pros of writing for the public, they tend to be short, 500 to 1,000 words. They take a minimal time investment, even though, yes, they are a time investment, especially if the topic that you are dealing with is pretty deep. But still, compared to writing a journal article or a book, for example, the blog post that I published about 4 weeks ago on nursology.net on decolonizing nursing was, it probably took me about 6 hours. Usually a blog post I can write in anywhere from half an hour to 2 to 3 hours. But that one was really important in terms of being very thoughtful and writing about a very sensitive topic. It took some time, and even the topic that I wanted to address, which was basically racism in nursing, um, uh, is hard to write about if you're just writing about racism. So what I did was take a journal article that was published in 2014 by authors from Canada and South Africa, talking about colonization and decolonization, and how colonized ideas or Eurocentric ideas are built into the very fabric of our nursing theories and ways of thinking. The article gave me a chance to kind of build off of that and talk about the important points in their article that were timely for us to pay attention to. The style is still very casual in comparison to writing for a journal, but it is not so casual that it's like a tweet or something like that. It still takes a little bit of attention to your style. But one reason that it's important to do this kind of writing is that writing for the public really demands that you use your voice, that you claim your identity, that you speak from yourself, that you are the I in the piece, even though you don't use personal pronouns often. You can, related to that, you can certainly express your opinion, but an opinionated piece is typically not very welcome. It's when you express your opinion, it's important to also acknowledge that this is your opinion and give a reason and a rationale, and maybe even a kind of a comparison between your opinion and other opinions that are out there. Then most of the public outlets do provide for interaction, and this is one of the main reasons to write for them, because it's kind of like going to a conference and presenting. You get the audience's reaction, and often having that before you publish a scholarly journal article is really helpful and really important. You find out if you've missed something, or if you have missed a point of view or a perspective that other people will express in relation to the topic that you're writing. Unfortunately, blogs don't get the kind of comment and responses that they allow for, but you can get it. And several of our blog posts have, on nursology.net in particular, have received comments. And that's a hint also to you as a reader. Do comment freely. And that gives you a chance to kind of, it's writing, even though it might be a very short, one paragraph, 3 or 4 sentences response, it does give you an opportunity to express your ideas in a public venue. The cons for this is that you really are limited to depth of information. Although you can go pretty deep, you can't explore everything in a public venue that you would in a scholarly article. Public venues are very vulnerable to misinterpretation and misuse, as are scholarly journal articles, but for public venues, it's even more so because your audience can be a lot broader with a lot more of diverse readers. And it could expose you to liability if the topic that you're talking about has to do with health advice or something that you're promoting for the public to take on as their own practices or anything. So for example, even if you were to do a blog post or an op-ed that really talks about how beneficial yoga is, you might get somebody coming back to object to something that you have said. And of course, the public venues are just as vulnerable to things like plagiarism, all forms of plagiarism, as any other venue. And so that's something to always be aware of as well. On Nurseology.net in particular, we've been very careful to include sources. Like even when we use an illustration or clip art, we try to give the source of this, well, we do give the source for all of our media or images that we post, which you don't find on many websites, but we believe that it's very important to do that. And the same applies to ideas that are expressed in the blog. We try to give a link at least. In writing on the web, we're going to be moving away from things like APA style and reference lists, although we do include them on Nurseology.net. But more important is a link to the original work or the work that we are citing. Okay, debunking the dominant myth that these venues are a waste of your time. They are not a waste of your time. They hone your writing skills. They increase your visibility for all audiences. They are indeed cited, giving you an altmetrics attention score and provide opportunities for feedback. I think this is a link. Let's look and see. Yeah. The altmetrics score on ANS, on the website, and on most other journals now, you will see this little donut, they call it. And it is gives you kind of a visual view, once you understand what all the colors mean, of where your audience is, how much attention your piece has gotten in the public. And they explain the colors: public documents, news, blogs, Twitter, and so forth. So they kind of harvest this information all off of the website based on what you have written for in a blog or in a journal article. And they're able to give you this donut score. When you look at journal articles on ANS, you'll see an altmetric score. Our donuts are pretty boring. We don't have a lot of citations or references or pickup from our articles, say on Twitter, although we do get a little bit, LinkedIn and so forth. But this is a procedure that has just started to happen. And in many audiences, it is actually considered more important than something like a journal impact score, because it does give you the sense of how much attention has your article gotten for in the public eye, or even in the scholarly world. Like every time somebody blogs about your journal article on Nurseology.net, that will get picked up and it will contribute to the yellow part of the donut. So it's an important thing to pay attention to and to know about.
Yeah. Peggy, yeah, she has a question on the.
You have to be sign up or register to those websites, the social media, in order to get these, like, you have to be a member of LinkedIn or like whatever social media they out there to get this recognition.
Repeat the question. I couldn't understand what you were saying. I think our sound is a little muffled.
My question is, do you need to be registered or sign up for those social media to become a member? To get to get a piece of color.
Yeah. So, like, if I'm not on LinkedIn or Facebook or any of those, I don't tweet or Twitter or whatever. Can I still get a donut?
Yes, yes, you do. Because it's not linked to you. Yeah, the donut isn't linked to you as a person. It's linked to what you wrote about. So, for example, I don't really participate in LinkedIn at all, but people on LinkedIn might mention an article that I wrote, or they might mention something in ANS, and the author of the ANS article gets credit for having that noticed on LinkedIn. So you don't have to belong to any of those sites. Anything that you write that gets attention on those platforms, that will give you your altmetric score. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. And I do recommend that you find several blogs that you like and follow them, and you know, pay attention to them. For example, I follow the Scholarly Kitchen, and I follow Patter. Of course, I follow Nursology.net and the ANS website. By following ANS and Nursology, even though I'm the web manager, I get notices of comments, and I wouldn't otherwise know that a comment was left. So it's important to me to know that somebody commented on something. And we love comments, but they're so rare. I had a ANS author whose article was featured recently, and she just emailed me and said she was worried that nobody was commenting. And I said, well, you know, probably out of 7 or 8 blog posts on ANS, we might get one comment. So for one article. So unfortunately, people haven't picked up on commenting. We know that it's being read because we get stats on who follows and what they view without even setting it up. Those stats come through every time you click on something on the web. Somewhere somebody is tracking what you're doing, not you as an individual necessarily, but the fact that you clicked on it adds up to how many clicks you got, that sort of thing. That's kind of wandering. Let's get back to the slides here. Okay. Here's sources that apply to journal articles, to magazines and newspapers as well. They're just really good resources on how to write for these particular venues, what the style is, and some examples. In particular, I want to point out this link to the Huffington Post author Mona Chattel. For those of you who are in psych, you might recognize her name. This is a little outdated. She's no longer at Rush University. She's at Johns Hopkins in Maryland. But she did most of her writing for Huffington Post op-eds about 3 or 4 years ago, and her content was really, really interesting. One of the topics that she wrote about was she did some research with truckers who were going through let's see where I have too many things open here. Okay. Truckers who are going through Chicago and the health challenges that they, particularly mental health challenges. And so she did a lot of writing of our op-eds. She also has a solid record of publication in scholarly journals, and she's the editor of one of the psych nursing journals. So she's really a good example of how somebody has been able to be productive, both in terms of professional writing and in terms of writing for the public. So these are good sources on how to do it, to get past your kind of fear of doing it. This is another good example. Vanessa is a relatively new nurse. I first met her when she was in the BS program, baccalaureate program at Louisiana State University about 4 or 5 years ago. And she's since graduated, and she she's currently getting her family nurse practitioner master's degree at Frontier University. But she moved from New Orleans to Maine about a year ago, and she wrote this piece for Ms. Magazine that was just published on February 25th. And it's really been wonderful to kind of, she's going to be at the Nursing Theory Conference in Cleveland at the end of this month. So watch her work. I don't know what that she's done writing yet for scholarly journals, but she's definitely on her way. She has her sights set on looking into PhD programs. And so as soon as she finishes her family nurse practitioner program, and probably is going to do a little bit of practice at somewhere. She has been practicing as a staff nurse, but it's a wonderful example of kind of a focus on your career that involves public activism and being concerned about health issues that are affecting us all. And writing for healthcare professionals and nurses, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that because it really is important. One thing that I would like to particularly emphasize is the importance of publishing in nursing journals. I don't know where this came about or how it happened, but there's started to be kind of this myth that it is less important to publish in nursing journals. At the it's kind of consistent with the all of the oppression dimensions that we experience in nursing, but it's reached into the publishing world where people think that publishing in a medical journal is far more prestigious than publishing in a nursing journal. To me, our own journals are very important, and they are beginning to be recognized by other fields as important sources for information. They're being cited. I think that was one of the things that led to this kind of prejudice against publishing in nursing journals, is that they're not read and cited by people in other fields. But this is a really tough issue that we really do need to address and find ways to reach other healthcare professionals, but the importance of developing our own discipline is really paramount. So the pros you know about really well, except that your writing capability is not usually one of the top things as to why you should do it or what are the advantages, but it's every time you write, you get better and better. And part of what makes your writing better is that if your article passes the review process and your article gets copy edited by a professional copy editor, you learn a lot about how to improve your writing. Um, it's not as obvious a learning experience now as it used to be, because authors used to get kind of the copy edited version of their manuscript, where they could see exactly what the copy editor did in terms of refining their style and their formatting and grammar and spelling and all of that. Now people don't get that. They just get the version that has been copy edited and set for preparation in print. So when you get to that point where you have now received the proofs, it's called, of your article, meaning your article has been moved from a manuscript double-spaced typed file to a PDF file that is suitable for publication in the journal. You really do have to read every single word of that copy edited manuscript, because some of what the copy editor might have done will not be appropriate, and it may not be obvious. So you really have to read the PDF file and take in what they have done to the manuscript that you submitted. The more that you write well and write appropriately for a particular outlet, the less you will have find has been done to your article. If you had a lot of writing problems, you will get you'll find that they do a lot of changing in the manuscript, and they also give you a lot of what we call AQs, author queries, questions about what you wrote that aren't clear. They'll say, this sentence is not clear, can you revise it? So you'll get a lot of good feedback from the experience of actually publishing. And publishing in of course, scholarly journals extends your professional network, because you will find that it will develop some connections to it, people who have read your work and think that it's important for one reason or another. There are a couple of cons that are important to know about or to recognize. They're probably familiar, but you may not have thought about them as a con. It does create a sense of public exposure and a challenge to your ideas. And this is the thing that I think intimidates many people who haven't published in scholarly journals, and even those of us who have published. I mean, I've submitted articles even in the last 5 years or so that when I actually hit the send button and get it in, it's kind of like, oh dear, what have I done? What are they going to think of this or something? So you do have that you have to overcome. And it does create a responsibility to sustain publishing momentum. It's so tragic when an author publishes one thing and then they don't continue. And the most stark example of this that is really, to me, so sad is Barbara Carper, whose article is the most frequently cited article in the nursing literature from 1978. And it still as current today as it ever was, but kind of a foundation of our theoretical and philosophic tradition in nursing. And yet she was not able to sustain her publishing momentum. And that was really the only time we heard from her. About 5 years ago, a doctoral student managed to contact her and do an interview with her that was published in ANS, which is very interesting and informative about her thinking. And I knew her personally, and I talked to her several times over the years about her ideas. And she was very supportive of the work that Mayana and I did in our knowledge development book to kind of extend her ideas around the patterns of knowing. But she herself, for whatever reason, was not able to sustain. So we still have her important work, but I think that it's really, when you publish one article, think of yourself as starting to or continuing your tradition of having kind of not just a CV, but a kind of a life of thought that is reflected in your writings. Here we get back to the first person pronoun. Do use them unless the guidelines indicate otherwise. And actually, we had a discussion on the Inane discussion board recently about how editors view first person pronouns. And I think out of probably 50 editors that contributed to that discussion, there was only one who said that her journal does not allow first person pronouns. And that's reflected in the author's guide. But by and large, editors they want an interesting, active voice manuscript. And usually you can write a whole active voice manuscript without ever referring to yourself, because the active voice doesn't mean that it's a voice in which you're not the actor in the sentence, but they do want an active voice. And when it does require that you refer to yourself, then you can do that. You can also edit. What I recommend to students is just write your thing and use your pronouns as any way you want, because a first draft of anything is just a first draft. And usually anything that you write will undergo many revisions. So for example, when I write an editorial, I write it and immediately read it and make changes and revisions. Sometimes those involve deleting some first person pronouns if I have too many in there. But usually like an editorial, which is about a 2-page piece, goes through about, if I could count them now with everything digital, you can't count how many drafts you had, but if I could count them, it would probably be 12 to 20 drafts of an editorial before it actually gets into print. So don't shy away from them when you start, then go back and look critically at how can I improve the writing here. Do follow the guidelines to the T. You can't imagine how many manuscripts editors get where the immediate thing they know is that the author did not even look at the guidelines, or they ignored part of the guidelines. Most of the emails I send back to authors when they submitted an article, when it isn't, when something needs to be done before we can proceed, I have to refer to the A&S guidelines because clearly the author did not look at them or follow them. And I can talk a little bit more about why that's important, because it's not just because we're sticklers for a certain way to do things. It boils down to a lot of implications for the publishing process. So if you want to talk about that more, I'll be glad to do that. Then read the journal that you are going to be publishing for, or if you're writing a book or a newspaper article or something else, read everything you can find that's related to that topic or that's in that particular outlet, and mimic the style that you observe in the most recent issues of the journal, because you know, this doesn't mean that you adjust your style or you change it, but certain things that you see in their published works that you can do. So for example, notice how often the journal articles tend to have headings or subheadings. And most journals like for headings or subheadings to be included about every 1 or 2 or 3 paragraphs, because it provides kind of a guide for readers to kind of be able to see what they're getting into. So for example, if you're reading a research article, you can go in immediately to the methodology section if there's a heading indicating that, or the conclusions section or something like that. So journals use different styles along that line, and so mimic them, find them and mimic them. And so now I'm going to shift to the writing something from a big project. And now what? Especially dissertations I have in mind with this. If you wait too long, with every passing day, the probability of you getting it done and being successful decreases. So I recommend within at least 2 weeks, even earlier if you can, have your overview article prepared and write a plan for any additional articles so you can kind of outline what you are plan to write based on your based on your article. And write and publish your scholarly report, your overview article first, if you possibly can. Then do not salami slice. This is, you can probably have at least 2, maybe 3, on a rare occasion, more than 3 articles from a dissertation. But salami slicing is different from developing articles that have meaning. Salami slices is when you take, say you have done a research project and you have a control group and a experimental group, and you write an article that only gives the results for the control group and another article that only gives the detailed response from the experimental group. And that kind of thing happens a lot in basic sciences. And so I've given some resources here that you can look at it. But for nursing, particularly qualitative studies, there are often many different kinds of articles that you can develop from what you have done. So for example, the most prolific author that has worked from her original research over the years and developed it further is Adeline Falk-Raffel, who did an oral history of public health nursing in Ontario, Canada. And she wrote about 6 articles based on her study that basically developed the themes that came from her study beyond the study. So they weren't just reporting on the study, but if there were, she would take a theme and then in her study, she reported on the results. In the articles, she explored that theme more in depth beyond what she found in her study. So do not salami slice. Just be aware of what that is. It won't probably be pertinent to many nursing scholars, but know what it is. And do not wait, not even a month, to get your first manuscripts ready. And do not neglect writing for the public. Put that in your plan. And sometimes you can write about what you're doing before you even are complete with the study, not reporting on the study, but something about the experience of working with a particular topic or with a particular population that you feel has some implications for writing for the public. So that's it. Let's see. Let's go back to Zoom. Questions or thoughts or additional ideas?
So, Peggy, I would like, if we could, Marianne is still up there. I made a list of the people who had submitted, and I know some people had the 1,000-word essay or their titles and things.
Yes.
So, Marianne, do you feel like you know, like what, I'm looking at yours here. It's The Death of PM Care was the title, and it's with 12-hour shifts and increased patient acuity. Patients do not receive PM care. The physical and relational benefits are lost. Are you good with, I know you said you already did it, so I'm guessing you're good with it.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with it. I'd love to know. I mean, it's something honestly that has been on my mind since I was in practice. So it was sort of nice to get it out. So I think, I'd love to have feedback on it, but yeah, I think and I only came up with like 750 words, but I'm
Yeah.
That's plenty.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm gonna stick with it.
So I just wanted to go through the people who are here, Peggy, that I can see. So I think Brianne is sitting next to me. She's one of our PhD students. And she submitted one that is, well, why don't you say what it is? Here it is.
The topic is nurse leadership beyond the hospital walls. And the takeaway message is utilizing nursing knowledge to lead and manage healthcare needs in the wake of a natural disaster. And so,
Talk a little bit more about what prompted that one.
what prompted us is because I'm originally from the Bahamas and they had a natural disaster. You guys know about Hurricane Dorian. And the initial relief of at the time when it happened in the wake up storm, is still a lot of things needed that I think requires a nurse's care to assess, the aftermath way after the actual storm. So I was thinking nurses should take the lead with that because we have the most knowledge, especially holistically, on the needs of people in that state.
Yes.
Yeah. And I saw that you said emerging nurse leader, but it could also be very nice for HAN. Don't you think? I think it might be something that HAN would be interested in as well.
Oh, definitely. And they do publish research articles. They're presented a little differently than they would be presented in nursing research, for example. But they do publish that. So keep that in mind for down the road too, because that is so important. I think what we're all going through right now in terms of the coronavirus scare is a really good example. And that's not exactly the same kind of natural disaster as a hurricane or something like that, or earthquake, but it still is a national prominent international health scare, and people need good information about it. So public venues for that kind of thing are just so important. For example, some of the best information that I've seen about the coronavirus are on the HAN blog, off the charts. And I think that I've given a link to but if you look at the American Journal of Nursing blog, Google it, you'll find it. But they had a really wonderful post, and they will continue to post information for the public and for practicing nurses about the information that we need to respond to what's happening. And I think focusing on what nurses bring to this is really, really important for the public to understand too.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you. So Lenny, I want to get Lenny in, and then I don't know if Lisa wants.
We're with now, we're
All right,
fine.
all right. So Lenny has go ahead, tell us.
Well, originally I have the other one because I just have the data, but I end up posting number 2. So it was,
It's not showing up on mine.
You have to refresh.
I thought so, but I'm not quite sure.
okay.
Oh, maybe.
Just, yeah.
Okay, originally I was going to do something about the
Yeah.
10 older adults because I have the data, but I was thinking, you just mentioned about the coronavirus and the pandemic, and I'm originally from Taiwan, so I still have some assets of the Taiwan's government, how they deal with this coronavirus and how they deal with this China. So I was thinking about put something together about the culturally sensitive care during the pandemic. There will be a title, and the content I was thinking about comparing the both side, East and West, and how the nurses' role play in this pandemic situation, and how they get involved because nurses play the front role. They were in the front row. They are the first line to do the evaluation, as doing the triage, and how nurses play this role. I don't have much information yet. I just have a topic and the idea.
Yeah, but I think
I'm thinking about submitting journal of transcultural nursing. because
Yes.
more wide audience, the readers.
Yes, that's excellent. Certainly timely.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. All right, so Lisa, do you have an idea that you want to share with us?
Oh, yes, I do. I did plug in there. Where am I? Here I am. So, of course, I love the edits and feedback, whatever.
O'clock.
But I have, the title is Time to Change Perception of Old Timers Disease.
Ah, yes.
And the takeaway is the many new advancements in the detection and management of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. It is time that we update our own and our patients' knowledge about these illnesses.
Very
And
good.
Great, thank you. And I thought about AGM before you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Wonderful.
it's great to publish in AJN. I really do. I think we don't do enough of that. Right.
I've actually been asked to write a 4,000-word article for the ANA. It used to be the American Nurse, now it's called something else.
Uh-huh.
Change the title. I was supposed to have it by the end of February and I didn't make it, so they've given me till March 26th. But that
Okay.
came out because they asked me to review an article and it was just awful. So I said, if you really want something, like this, it's my area. I work with the Fabulous Winter, he's an expert in it, so we can put together an article for you. I'm also pulling in one of my nurse mentors too on it. So yeah. So
Great.
that will be my first time that I have, tried to do anything for the public. So I appreciate it learning about that today.
Great. Wonderful. This is great.
Okay, so look at that, right? As soon as I was about to do mine. It went away. I
Want me
don't
to
know.
read yours? I have yours.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, so because I've been following the blog now, right? Because Shannon put me into the Nurseology blog, and or just recently, maybe. Yeah. So I had looked at what she had written, and
Yes.
I just think there's a little bit more that could be said about taking nursing theory out of the shade for practicing nurses.
Yes.
And I think that one of the things that comes to my mind is just what we're talking about, and that is we've got to publish it AJN
Right.
or to 2020 or whatever,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. And somehow we have to stop as an institution saying that those don't matter when you go up for promotion and tenure.
That's right.
In some ways, they matter more.
They do.
So it's things like that. So it would be more like what are some tips for making it meaningful for practicing nurses? We have to make it real for them. We don't.
That's
do
right.
that.
That's right.
That's what I'm thinking about.
Wonderful. That's great. Well, this has been great. We can sign off and I'll put the recording on Canvas. And then we'll be together on Zoom in April again. And then all day in May.
Very good. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right.